Most of us have been raised on some sort of fairy tale, fable, or folklore. Maybe you grew up watching fairy tale movie adaptations or reading Aesop's fables. Maybe your parents told you folk tales at night before bed. But where do these tales come from? According to folklore professor Maria Tatar, when it comes to fairy tales, there are no originals, only variations on a theme. That's why, in some cases, Snow White doesn't have fair skin, or Cinderella's slipper isn't made of glass. But where do such variants come from, and why are some of them more famous than others? The answer isn't simple, but much of it can be boiled down to culture. In Snow White's case, the lead character is expected to be beautiful, but fair skin isn't a prized beauty standard in every culture. That's why we can sometimes get tales of a dark-skinned girl who isn't named Snow White but lives through her story all the same. That said, fairy tales aren't the only things that change according to culture. Art and music change too. If we follow fairy tales and music across the world, we can see just how much historical events and cultural movements change a story or a tune. Welcome to Story to Song, where we explore how stories connect to music and more. Today's theme, canonicity. Let's start with a surprisingly complex question. How do you summarize Snow White? Well, you might say something like this. Once upon a time, there's a queen who thinks she's really beautiful, but then a magic mirror tells her that Snow White is prettier. The queen gets mad and tries to have Snow White killed, so Snow White flees and hides with 7 dwarves. Eventually, the queen realizes Snow White is still alive, so she disguises herself as a hag and feeds Snow White a poisoned apple. This puts Snow White in a coma, but fortunately, your local necrophilic prince stops by and thinks, I need to marry that corpse, and kisses her and brings her back to life because that's how poisoned apples work. The queen gets pushed out of the picture, and everyone lives happily ever after. The end. Now, this is a quick and dirty summary of Disney's Snow White, which is probably the most well-known version of the story. But Disney's version is in itself an adaptation of Schneewittchen, or Little Snow White, which was published in 1812 by the Brothers Grimm. The Grimm version of Snow White follows the same story beats as Disney's version, but there are a few differences. In the Grimm version, for example, the poisoned apple actually represents the queen's 3rd attempt at killing Snow White. She tries to use a poisoned lace, whatever that is, then a poisoned comb, but the dwarves manage to come home and foil her efforts every time. Another big difference is that instead of falling off of a cliff, the queen is forced to dance herself to death in red-hot shoes. Yeesh. Still, at the end of the day, the Grimm version and the Disney version of Snow White are super similar. And even though there have been tons of movie adaptations for Snow White, they're usually based on one of these 2 versions. So, since Disney based things off of the Brothers Grimm, does that make the version by the brothers the quintessential version, or the canonical version? Folklore studies definitely treat it that way. In the world of folklore, there's something called the Arne Thompson-Uther Type Index, or the ATU Fable Index for short. This is a massive catalog that attempts to squeeze every widely studied story into orderly categories. Snow White actually has an ATU index number, ATU 709, and if you access that number in the catalog, you'll find tens of Snow Whitish tales listed there. But ATU 709 stories are described according to the Brothers Grimm version. Heck, even the category of ATU 709 itself is called Snow White. Even though we know that many Snow Whitish characters don't have pale skin and aren't named anything remotely close to Snow White, we still seem to categorize the tales according to the Brothers Grimm standards. That's kind of crazy when you think about fairy tales as a whole. Fairy tales are fireside stories made by the people for the people. They're not things we can attribute dates of origin to, let alone canonicity or originality. The Brothers Grimm themselves made their version of Snow White by collecting tons of versions in Germany, taking out the logical inconsistencies, and adding some melodramatic flair for average readers. And this seems to have made it the canonical version, and the most popular one as well. Now, if you're a classical music fan, you might be jumping when I say the word canon, and not because it's the thing that goes boom. The canon in the classical music world is a group of what some might call quintessential works, ones that every musician knows and most non-musicians too. For example, now, every piece of the canon is good in some way or another. There's a reason why they've survived in cultural memory for so long and why they're still used or referenced in movies or even memes. But the canon is also limited. Most of the composers included in the canon are dead white guys, and also most of them are German. Bach, German. Beethoven, German. Kind of interesting that the Brothers Grimm are also German and also seem to be in charge of the canonical fairy tales. So is Germany just the land of canonical things? Not really. I think it's more related to the desire to record things. For example, Bach wasn't super popular as a composer when he was alive, but he did get his wives and kids to put a huge portion of his works on paper. That made his works easier to rediscover and get obsessed over down the line. The Brothers Grimm have a similar kind of story because they were collecting fairy tales for a reason. They wanted to preserve their land's culture. In fact, there's a thought that Snow White's black hair, white skin, and red lips are supposed to represent the German flag, which was colored that way at the time. But to say that the desire to record things is what gets canonicity is to sell the game very short. Like I mentioned before, at least part of it must be related to quality. Something has to be good to join the canon, after all. But then, who decides what's good? Essentially, there are people who want to be remembered, aka most everyone, and there are people who judge archived content and decide whether or not it's actually worth remembering, aka not most everyone. And unfortunately, those judging people can be really biased or really just ignorant of everything else that exists, so if we leave all of the judging to them, we miss out on a lot of amazing stuff. When something is canon, there's a bit of an implication that it's the best. But what makes something the best depends on you, your biases, your taste, your preferences. I'd put Bach in my canon in a heartbeat, but that doesn't mean you would. And I wouldn't make the Grimm version of Snow White the canon one if I was judging things, but that doesn't mean you should agree. I think it's important to know that the canon is not where the repertoire, musical or literary, ends. There's a lot more out there that's really good, and sometimes you just need to do a lot of digging to find it. So maybe you're thinking, what if we do away with the canonicity completely? If artists and composers and authors get stomped on by the canon, shouldn't we just get rid of it to give everyone a fair fighting chance? That sounds great conceptually, but it does have some consequences. Let's start off with a bookish example. Suppose I'm trying to recommend a book to my friend. I want my friend to understand that this book is like Lord of the Rings, but with a battle royale storyline like Hunger Games. But let's say that my friend knows literally nothing about either of those series. When I tell them, you've got to read this book because it's LOTR meets Hunger Games, or whatever, they literally have no idea what I'm talking about. Now here's a musical example, and one that I've actually lived through. I'm a singer, and I have a YouTube channel. On that channel, I post a lot of underperformed music. It's kind of my shtick. From a canonicity perspective, the most famous piece on my channel is a 2019 recording of Bach's aria Zerfließe. I use my channel as a kind of digital portfolio for people who might want to hire me in the future, and you would not believe how many people have told me, "Oh, I watched your Bach video. I know it's a bit old, but I thought it was really good." I have other videos I posted since then, and I promise I sound better than I did in 2019. So why do my potential hiring folk not watch these videos? Because it's hard to judge those. Someone can talk to you in German, and you can be impressed by the sound of it, but if you're not familiar with German itself, you have no idea if they're speaking it correctly, or tastefully, or whatever. The same applies to my lesser performed music. And that's what the canon, literary or musical, boils down to, a common language. Yes, the fact that ATU 709 is called the Snow White category is problematic, but we also know it's commonly understood. We know that the Snow White category of fairy tales refers to a beautiful girl, a wicked mother figure, a poisoned object, and some sort of sleep. Without a commonly known canon for everyone to latch onto, it would be hard to critique, analyze, or recommend things to other people. It would be like speaking in different languages, forever. But here's the thing, languages evolve. Words become archaic, change meaning, or get invented all the time, and the same should apply to any form of the canon. The classical and fairy tale canons are old and outdated. There are probably things that should be removed, changed, or added to for both. But how do you or I make those kinds of changes? Part of it boils down to influence. In today's world, a viral meme might be able to change the meaning of a slang word. But more importantly, you just have to learn. Just as people can learn a new language, all of us can learn about different versions of Snow White until we all decide to overcome the patriarchy and crown a new version as the canon one. And the same applies to classical music. Fall down research rabbit holes. Find versions of things that speak to you, but aren't necessarily canon, and check out the description for a couple of resources that might provide you with a starting point. Thanks for tuning in.